Hi, welcome to today's video, The Persian Gulf Trap. Why invading Iran is easier than securing it. As the U.S. sends its Marines and the 82nd Division into the region, the war has entered a new phase, so the ground invasion phase. Iran and the Persian Gulf are easy to enter, hard to hold, and brutal to leave. That is the real logic of war in the Persian Gulf, because this is not a theater that rewards clean conquest. It is a theater that punishes overconfidence, stretches logistics, and turns technical success into strategic exposure even for the most advanced military force in the world. This episode asks a simple question. What if the real trap is not getting into Iran, but what happens after? But before any further discussion on the military analysis, we need to first take a look at the geographic conditions of the Persian Gulf theater. And the first aspect is geography. The Persian Gulf is a semi-enclosed sea about 650 miles long, between 40 and 210 miles wide, with an average depth of only 164 feet or only 50 meters. Even at the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz, depth is generally only 60 to 100 meters. This matters immediately. A shallow littoral sea behaves very differently from open ocean. It compresses maneuver space, favors coastal surveillance and ambush, and makes maritime traffic more predictable. The Gulf's shoreline is also broken by numerous coves and inlets, many man-made breakwaters, and 17 Iranian islands, all of which can serve as anchorages, hiding points, dispersal nodes, and small boat operating positions. Those islands also perform a natural barrier at the mouth of the Gulf. The second aspect is temperature. As it may surprise you, the climate directly shapes operations. From May to October, summer conditions are extremely hot and humid, with temperatures reaching 52 degrees and humidity up to 90% in some areas. Under such conditions, sustained daytime small boat operations are almost impossible unless the boats are air-conditioned. Heat and humidity also degrade electronics and radar performance, especially the small marine radars used on Iranian speedboats, through the elevated evaporation duct effect. The region only enjoys about 3 to 5 months of temperate weather in a year, which means naval operations in the Gulf must constantly contend with environmental stress on crews, sensors, and small craft. The next point is visibility. Visibility is unstable as well. Seasonal storms and occasional sandstorms make small boat operations, landing operations, and various operations dangerous, while early morning fog, salt, haze, or dust, especially from May to August, can reduce visibility to 2 to 6 miles, and sometimes to as little as half a mile. For the force built around fast coastal craft, or the force intended to close air support or landing operations, surprise approach and short-range harassment, that kind of atmosphere is not just a hazard, it is also an opportunity. The predominant counterclockwise current in the northern Persian Gulf, covering with 4 smaller currents, can provide convenient starting conditions for the Iranians to launch small boat attacks. In other words, the Gulf is not just shallow, it's also meteorologically and hydrographically favorable to friction, concealment, and sudden contact. What's more, the acoustic environment is also difficult. Sonar performance in the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf can be degraded by high ambient noise levels, making the task of detecting, locating, and identifying submarines very difficult. In the hot, shallow, noisy littoral sea, even small and midget submarines can become more technically useful than outsiders might assume. Not because they're invulnerable, but because the battle space itself degrades the quality of sonar search and classification. Apart from the natural conditions, the commercial routes constitutes an important part of the environment of the Persian Gulf theater. So Hormuz is a choke point, not simply because it is narrow in nature, but because its traffic is even narrower. So the strait and its approaches run about 120 miles, narrowing from 60 in the west to 24 miles in the east, while commercial shipping is funneled into tightly regulated 2-mile wide lanes on the Omani side. Overlooking these roads are, for example, Hormuz, Larak, the Tams, Farah, Abu Musa, in islands, I believe 7 islands like this, giving Iran surveillance and forward positions directly beside the channels that matter. The result is a maritime bottleneck where ships move through predictable corridors under the shadow of the Iranian-held islands. So the takeaway for this section is the Persian Gulf is a battle space designed by nature and commerce to favor denial over control. It is shallow enough to complicate undersea search, hot enough to punish crews and electronics, hazy enough to degrade visibility, structured enough to channel tanker traffic into predictable corridors, and broken enough by islands, coves, and coastal infrastructure to support concealment and dispersed small boat operations by the defensive side. That is why any serious analysis of the Iranian naval power must begin not with ship counts, but with the physical environment of the Gulf itself. So after sufficient understanding of the geographic conditions, I will introduce the IRGC entrenchment of 4 decades in the Persian Gulf to you. So over the 4 decades, the Revolutionary Guard has not merely deployed forces along Iran's southern coast, it has engineered the battle space itself. Harbors, piers, fishing or trading settlements already provide concealment for small combatants. But the more important point is that Iran has gone beyond the natural cover. It has bored tunnels into the rocky islands, built covered locks and concrete pens, and created launch positions from which speedboats can surge directly into shipping lanes with minimal warning. Some craft can even be launched from flatbed trucks under cover of darkness at high tide. The operational effect is straightforward: shorter transit time, less exposure before contact, and greater tactical surprise. As pointed out by the former IRGC commander, Americans and Westerners labeled our activities guerrilla warfare to contrast it with their own classic warfare, which is not true. We have developed a fully classic capability tailored to our requirements. We don't play by their rules. Instead, we force them to play by our rules in our backyard. This infrastructure also suggests preparation not just for harassment, but for massed expendable attack in a naval war with Western powers. Many IRGC Navy bases are expected to contain warehouses filled with suicide autonomous craft. That matters because it points to the force designed for saturation, persistence, and low-cost attrition rather than for conventional fleet combat. And as demonstrated in the Ukrainian war, the autonomous craft could do major damage to the conventional fleet like the Russian one. In the confined waters of the Gulf, a stockpile of such systems could be used to multiply pressure on escorts, commercial shipping, and maritime infrastructure at relatively low cost to Iran. Just as important, the IRGC's method of war is built around deliberate ambiguity. Iran's asymmetric warfighters seek to maximize the fog of war by hiding among civilian elements. In the maritime space, where more than 3,000 local vessels and dozens of tankers and cargo ships move through the Gulf and Hormuz daily, distinguish civilian traffic from hostile approach craft becomes extremely difficult, especially when unconventional forces use local civilian boats to close with their targets. This means Iran's advantage is not only firepower, it is also the defender's uncertainty. Finally, the IRGC's sea denial system is not confined to the immediate shoreline. Iranian autonomous coastal missile teams practice deploying and launching anti-ship missiles with ranges of roughly 120 to 300 kilometers from hidden sites tens of kilometers away inland. That gives the systems depth. Even if exposed coastal positions or island sites are struck, Iran can still generate anti-ship fire from concealed inland nodes connected to the coast by roads, storage sites, and pre-planned firing positions. In other words, after 40 years of preparation, the IRGC has built not just coastal defenses, but a layered, concealed, and geographically distributed denial network. But since the U.S. is determined for the amphibious assault or the ground operation, we also need to study from history. So post-World War II U.S. amphibious operations experience, and to see if we can get some perspectives here. So large-scale or post-amphibious assault is one of the hardest operations in war. So it is one of the most difficult forms of war to fight. And the United States has very little post-World War II experience doing it against a defended shore. After the Second World War, most U.S. amphibious or intervention operations were either permissive, lightly opposed, or politically collapsed before the landing. For example, Beirut in 1958 was effectively unopposed. Panama in 1989 was a joint intervention, not a classic defended beach assault. And Haiti in 1994 was prepared as a forcible entry against this small country, but became permissive after the regime backed down. The clearest post-war benchmark for a major amphibious landing under real hostile fire remains Incheon in the Korean War in 1950, which succeeded but is remembered precisely because such operations are so rare, risky, and dependent on surprise, timing, hydrography, and follow-on logistics. So eventually we are getting into this part where we elaborate the core conclusion of this video. The operation will be like this: easy to go in, harder to hold on, and hopeless to pull out. First, our first discussion will be on the Kharg Island. So Kharg is the easiest of the three scenarios we listed here to imagine and the easiest to oversell. A U.S. Marine amphibious force could probably raid it, seize key facilities, or temporarily occupy parts of it. But that is the easy part. I've no doubt they are totally capable of doing that. But the harder question begins the moment the island is taken. Then what? Kharg sites close to the Iranian mainland, and any occupying force would be fixed on a small island under constant threat of missile, drone, rocket, and artillery fire from the coast or from follow-on Iranian retaliation elsewhere. So even if the seizure succeeded tactically, the occupation would create a new burden. The U.S. would have to keep resupplying, reinforcing, and defending a small exposed position whose political and strategic purpose would rapidly become unclear. And imagine resupplying itself would create even more vulnerability to the US side and more opportunity for the Iranian to gain tactically. A raid is one thing, a durable occupation and a long-range fire is something else. That is exactly the kind of gap between operational success and strategic sense that amphibious enthusiasts often understate. The second scenario that we could imagine, as you can see here, is the southern coastline. So a lodgment on Iran's southern coast is more feasible in the abstract than a march on at least Tehran, I don't know. But it is also far more demanding than taking a single island. For example, taking the major ports on the southern coastline would, of course, do a significant damage to the Iranian economy to sustain its war effort. But once you move from an island objective to the strip of mainland coastline, you are no longer talking about a raid. You are talking about a sustained coastal campaign. Securing ports, clearing approaches, protecting logistics, defending against inland missile fire, and maintaining enough force density to avoid being pinned to the few vulnerable enclaves or beaches. And even if the United States captured a major port or export node, the same problem would remain. How do you sustain it, and how do you leave eventually? Coastal occupation does not solve the strategic problem. It simply enlarges the perimeter and multiplies the logistics burden. Eventually, you have the last option, which is a full-scale inland ground invasion, and that sounds crazy. So an inland invasion is where the scale problem becomes brutal. Iran's surface area is about 1.75 million square kilometers versus about 438,000 for Iraq. So in other words, Iran is roughly 4 times bigger, and its population is now around 92 million versus roughly 46 million for Iraq, so about twice as populous. Iran is also geographically much harder. Much of the country is organized around a mountain-ringed plateau bounded by the Zagros in the west and the Alborz in the north, with deserts and dried salt lakes in the distributed, dispersed in the center of the country, whereas Iraq's decisive center of gravity in 2003 lay across much more accessible alluvial plains and lowland corridors. And even Iraq, the easier case, was not cheap or simple. By April the 30th, 2003, the United States had 466,985 personnel deployed, so roughly 500,000 personnel deployed for Operation Iraqi Freedom, including large active reserve and National Guard components, and you need 6 months to mobilize those National Guards. Contemporary Army logistics reporting says that during the war, about 31.5 million tons of material was shipped from the United States and elsewhere all across the ocean to the theater to support the campaign. So when people casually talk about just invading Iran, they're skipping over the fact that the last major US ground invasion in the region required hundreds of thousands of personnel, massive reserve mobilization, and an extraordinary logistics pipeline. And that was for a country much smaller and operationally easier than Iran. That is the key point of the section. Getting in is not the same as holding on, and holding on is not the same as getting out. Kharg could perhaps be seized, part of the southern coast could perhaps be occupied, but the deeper the United States goes, the more the problem stops being military entry and becomes political endurance, logistical sustainability, and eventual extraction. And that is where easier scenarios die. So here's my final remark. Capturing territory temporarily is one thing, but what then is something else entirely. An endless war could tear America apart politically and drain it economically, given the current situation of domestic politics and the fairness situation of the United States. History offers a warning here. Even the Mongols, for all their ferocity, could not simply bend the proud Iranian plateau into easy submission. Hemingway wrote, "But man is not made for defeat. A man can be destroyed, but not defeated." That line applies not only to individuals, but to almost every civilization with a proud past. Like so many hegemons before it, America risks developing complacency as an incurable disease. When air superiority works over and over again, when near zero casualties can deliver the enemy's demise from a distance without putting boots on the mud, decision makers, the media, and the public inevitably lose their sense of war's true weight. War becomes a video game played in some faraway corner of the world map, and defeat begins to feel impossible. That is why the moment felt so revealing when an American host asked Iran's foreign minister whether he feared a U.S. ground invasion, only to receive a calm and concise reply, "We are waiting for them." The surprise was not on the Iranian side, it's on the American side. And why wouldn't that hubris continue? For now, America still has the power to indulge it. Empires usually do, right up until they no longer can. Thank you for sticking to the end of the video. If you like our analysis, if you think the content is helpful, please consider clicking the like button and subscribe this channel so you can receive notifications when we post a video. And thanks for watching, and we will see each other in the next video.